Hello and welcome to History Respawned. I'm your host Bob Whitaker. Today's episode considers Hades, the new roguelike action-adventure RPG from Supergiant Games. The game follows the story of Zagreus as he attempts to escape the Greek underworld with the help of the gods of Olympus against the wishes of his father, Hades, the lord of the underworld. The game features excellent gameplay as well as wonderful writing, which takes a tongue-in-cheek, irreverent approach to the familiar relationships between the gods of the underworld and the gods of Olympus. To help me make sense of the Greek underworld and Greek mythology in general, I've invited back onto the show Dr. Kate Cook. Kate, welcome back to History Respawned.
Thanks very much for having me, Bob. It's always great to do this.
Good. Awesome. All right, so I've got the title screen here. I was going to jump in, and I've got two different playthroughs. You can see the one on the left where I've made quite a bit of progress. So I wasn't going to start with that, primarily because I was worried about spoilers for our viewers. But in the maybe second half of this episode, I'm going to switch over to this more advanced version of the game. So if you are sensitive to spoilers, and there is a lot of great story spoilers in this game, I will let you know when we switch over, just so that doesn't ruin anybody's day. I would hate that because this game is really great. And then in the center here, we've got a new playthrough that I started where I've only made a few escape attempts. You can see the difference here, 47 escapes to 7 escapes, and then total darkness. Wow, that is a really big difference. But let's jump into this one here, and let's take a look. Okay, and so this kind of playthrough is starting at one of the runs. And so this is a roguelike game in which you start the game back here at the House of Hades and then progress on through this section into the kind of various levels of the Greek underworld. So I'm just going to kind of play through here a bit. I might do some fishing. And I'll just ask you, Kate, you've been playing this game a bit. I don't know if you've played it as obsessively as I have. But what do you make of this game's depiction of the Greek underworld so far?
I haven't played it quite as much as you, although I'm quite impressed that you've finished it on 47 attempts, because I'm on something like 20 and I'm really stuck.
Oh.
So 47 does not look hopeful for me. But in terms of the underworld, I think it's very interesting. I think a lot of the things that they've taken are quite clearly drawn from some of the material we've got on Greek myth and how that treats the underworld. So obviously the names of various realms that you go through are all taken from the text, but quite a lot of the depictions as well, the idea of it being mostly gloomy, filled with shades, some of whom are more communicative than others, depending on how important they are as characters. That's something we see elsewhere as well. Mm-hmm. So it's effective, I think, as a representation.
Awesome. Yeah. And so I didn't plan this, but we've got this portal to chaos here. And this is one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, because, we've got this collection of Greek gods. We've got the gods of the underworld, and then we've got the gods of Olympus. And I kind of feel like these gods are generally known to just about everybody, particularly the gods of Olympus, but they've got this added god here, chaos, which is something I've never heard about with reference to Greek mythology. And I was wondering, is there any kind of reference to this in Greek mythology? Is this something you've come across in the game yet?
Yes, it is. I'm not a fan of chaos in the game. He keeps offering me trades that will ruin my life, it seems like. But yes, so chaos is something that we find in Greek mythology and in some Greek texts, but it's quite interesting that they've gone for a sort of a they character for chaos. Mm-hmm. Because the word chaos in Greek is neuter, so it's neither masculine nor feminine, and it really just means a gaping void. Quite a lot of the sort of primordial forces that you get in the beginnings of Greek mythology, and we hear about these from Hesiod particularly, are both sort of personifications of a thing and a sort of character. So Ocean is a good example, or indeed Gaia, who is both Earth and a female character of sorts. So Chaos seems to be one of these. There is a name associated, very limited stories. Chaos is not really associated with doing much except existing. But it is some kind of void. So the fact that they've got this chaos in this game is something you go down to as a space beneath everything else is quite interesting. And chaos is from chaos, everything else comes, according to Hesiod. So things like Earth and indeed the underworld itself all come from chaos.
Fascinating. Yeah, and that's kind of what we get from this personification of chaos in the game. It has chaos, primordial originator, and so this is a character that kind of takes credit for a lot of the goings on within the underworld and with the Olympians. And I think it's interesting to hear you describe it as just kind of a nebulous, empty force or object, and yet here we've got a kind of a physical being that takes on this role. Although I do really like the artwork here, especially with this being holding the world in their finger. I kind of pinched together in their two fingers. I really enjoy that.
It's fascinating. I mean, it's quite interesting. In Hesiod's account, some of the things that come from chaos are just described as coming from chaos. Some of them are described as actually being born from chaos. So then you have some kind of impression of parentage or personhood going on here. But it doesn't specify sort of what the difference is between these two conceptions, or why some are different, why some are born and some just exist. It just says that some things are born, like children. And Nyx, in fact, who is a character in this game, is one of those who is born from chaos, according to Hesiod.
Right, yeah, and I can scroll down here. We've got Chaos's first entry here. Again, this is early on in the game, and you can see you learn more about these characters and kind of the general context of the game by accepting boons. And these are kind of upgrades to your player character as you go along. And so as you accept those boons, you learn more about the backstories for these characters. And then Nyx is here. And she is depicted in the game, at least, as kind of a mother figure to most of the figures in the underworld, including Hypnos and Meg. And there are some moments later on in the game where Nyx and Chaos often refer to one another. So I think it's interesting that you point out that kind of close relationship between the two. Okay, well, I will continue on, and now I've accepted this boon from Chaos, so it means that I can't see what the reward in the next chamber will be, so I'm just going to take a guess. So while I kind of beat up these baddies here, and these thug characters, I feel like they look quite a bit like kind of the figures and characters you might see in, say, like Disney's version of the underworld in the movie Hercules. And some of the artwork looks kind of clearly inspired with that, with the blue flames and the blue candles all strewn about, particularly in this early area of Tartarus. So, Kate, I was wondering if you could tell us, what are the sources of knowledge for the Greek underworld? Are there, particular accounts that kind of delve into this, or is it the knowledge of the underworld just kind of strewn about throughout various accounts, and there's not like kind of one text that we rely on?
So it's really the latter. We've got references to the underworld in quite a lot of early Greek literature, but it tends to be quite sparse, and we haven't got anything that sort of schematically lays out what the situation is. So I've mentioned Hesiod already, and Hesiod refers to the underworld and sort of underworld gods and so on, particularly in the Theogony, which is a poem about the nature of the world and the beginnings of the gods. So kind of how the world is put together. And this is probably 7th century BC. Before that, we've also got our old friend Homer, who we talked about for
Oh
Troy
yeah,
Total War.
nice.
Now, the Iliad and the Odyssey don't talk a lot about the underworld, but they do mention, for example, characters going down to the underworld, and Odysseus has in the Odyssey an opportunity to summon some of the ghosts on the edge of the underworld. So he travels to where the underworld sort of physically is, stands at the edge, and then calls up some ghosts to talk to them. And then later we hear about some people who Odysseus has killed later on in the poem going down into the underworld. And again, there's a very brief description. So it's not kind of schematic about the nature of the underworld, but there are brief references. As we get later into Greek literature, sort of through the 6th and then into the 5th century BC, again, poets tend to bring it up in relation to something particular that they're talking about. So another myth of a hero going down to the underworld, for example, Hercules, but also Theseus, a character who has a catabasis. This is a going down into the underworld myth. And so poets will refer to that, or we have Greek tragedies, which feature some of these stories. Most of which don't seem to be sort of set in the underworld, although there is a very interesting Greek comedy where Dionysus goes down into the underworld in order to visit it and pick one of the tragedians of Athens to bring back with him to Athens.
No kidding.
So, yeah.
I would say out of the character depictions in this game, I think Dionysus is probably my favorite out of all of the characters, but that's just me. I think his upgrades are also really nice as well in terms of gameplay.
Yes, his upgrades are great, and he's so cheerful. He's always very encouraging. He shows up and says, "You're going to do great. Keep going."
I know he's like a really supportive uncle. I suppose he's a cousin of Zagreus, but yeah, it's a great character, great depiction, and I think the voice acting is, I don't know, it just sounds like what I think Dionysus, if he was personified, would sound like, I suppose. Yeah.
Interestingly, in the game, he's a cousin, but possibly in Greek myth, Dionysus and Zagreus might be the same person.
No kidding. Wow.
Which adds a really interesting, complicating factor.
Fascinating. Well, that's, I mean, there's not that many opportunities to kind of put your own stamp on Zagreus's character. He's a bit of a just kind of a static character in an RPG sense, but at least my version of Zagreus is very, very friendly with Dionysus, and so that warms my heart to hear that he may in fact actually be the same person, at least in terms of Greek mythology.
It's not all versions of Zagreus, I should perhaps say. We don't have, I mean, this, I think it's really interesting that the game designers have picked out Zagreus as someone they want to talk about, because we have really one reference, maybe two, to Zagreus in certainly early Greek literature. And it's a quote from a play of Aeschylus, and it's actually Sisyphus, who we also meet in this game, saying goodbye to Zagreus, and that's all we've got.
Wow.
And possibly his father, and this is where we get the kind of note that Zagreus is therefore in this play the son of Hades. But this is not in the original play, at least it's not in the quote we've got. Someone has just commented it underneath. They've explained, oh, by his father, the Aeschylus meant Hades here.
Ah, I see. Well,
and this is pretty much it.
Yeah, well, that's fascinating. But I feel like, it almost makes sense that the developers at Supergiant Games would have picked a figure in Greek mythology that we don't know a lot about, because then they could kind of imprint whatever ideas they wanted to on that character for this game. Whereas with, figures like Hades and Dionysus and particularly Zeus, I feel like we probably know a lot more about those figures. And so it's a little bit more difficult to play fast and loose with the character depictions in those regards.
Yes, I think you're probably, I assume that's partly what they've done, is they've tried to pick something that no one would kind of write to them and say, that's not right, that's not how this character should be.
Oh, those pesky classical scholars, just always criticizing games. So here we've got our first boon from an Olympian. So we've got Artemis, goddess of the hunt. And so throughout the game, as you go into each new area, you have the opportunity to accept these rewards from the Olympians, who are attempting to help Zagreus make his way through the underworld on the assumption that Zagreus is traveling to reach them, to travel to Mount Olympus to escape the underworld. And so you've got these personifications of these various Greek gods. And so this is, I think this might be the first boon on this playthrough that I've received from Artemis. And so as the goddess of the hunt, most of these boons are focused on critical damage, on increasing the kind of damage dealt by your attacks. So I'm going to go with this Hunter Dash here because I'm doing a lot of dash strikes. And then we've got the previews back, and I think so. We've got another potential for an Artemis one or a Demeter boon. So I think I'm going to go for Demeter so we can see what she looks like.
I have not met her yet.
Oh, really? Oh, well, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry for the spoilers.
No, it's fine.
So, what you had said about the kind of history of the texts that refer to the underworld, and here, let's take a look at Demeter here for a second. Oh, no. Well, she didn't show up. But she's depicted as a frosty, elderly lady. Hopefully she'll show up again at some point. I don't know why she didn't show up this time. Oh, I suppose because I'd already accepted a boon from her, and that's why. Okay, your special inflicts chill. Bonus restoration. Let's go with this. Sorry, I'm just trying to think my way through this.
The most violent wretches of Tartarus are sealed away even from other condemned souls. Their only visitors, those fool enough to attempt escape.
I love the sound of the narrator's voice here. What was I talking about before I got sidetracked? I was fascinated to hear about these sources that we have for the underworld, and it seems like from the perspective of the game, it seems like there's a long history of people going into the underworld or people trying to leave the underworld. Is that a kind of narrative? Is that backed up by the sources that we have?
To some extent, yes. So mostly not a lot of people try to leave. So Sisyphus, who we're just about to meet, it turns out, is the most famous example and kind of the main example of someone who doesn't stay in the land of the dead in Greek mythology. And he is referred to in the Odyssey as being punished, although the Odyssey doesn't specify why he's being punished. But the assumption is that the audience knows it's for trying to escape, because there's not any other reason for this punishment that Odysseus is aware of him having. And then when we get on to Aeschylus, we get, we don't have, but there were whole tragedies about Sisyphus escaping from the underworld. So it was a kind of story they were particularly interested in. Sisyphus supposedly escapes because he's the most clever of all mortals, so he manages to trick death on multiple occasions. First, he says to I can't remember which order the two things come in, but on one occasion he says that his wife hasn't buried him properly, so he has to go back up and tell her off. And Hades says, "Fair enough, that seems legitimate, but you'll have to come back afterwards." And then he does this, and then he doesn't come back, obviously. And Hades sends Thanatos back to pick him up on one occasion, and Sisyphus binds him, and then no one can die.
Oh my goodness.
Because death is bound by Sisyphus. And so Ares has to come and free Thanatos in order to make sure that people could die again. And then eventually, finally, after a long life, Sisyphus goes down to the underworld, and he's given this boulder in order to prevent him from escaping again.
So how does that relationship with the boulder work? I mean, is it? I assume, because of the assumption is that he rolls it up the hill and then it comes down again, and he has to redo it every day. I mean, how does that bind him to the underworld? Is he supposed to be physically attached to the boulder? Is that how it's supposed to work?
I mean, it's not always totally precise, but yes, I think generally the idea is that he'll be chained to the boulder. There's also a sort of sense, though, with some of these punishments in the underworld, that you just have to keep doing it, even though you shouldn't necessarily want to. So other punishments include, for example, the daughters of Danaus have to endlessly collect water in jugs that have holes in. There's no indication that these jugs are sort of attached to them or that they're bound or anything, but nonetheless they have to keep doing them. So Sisyphus, to some extent, just sort of has to keep performing this duty. But certainly in some artistic representations, he's indicated, just as he is in this game, actually, as being chained to the boulder. So he has even less choice.
Interesting. And, I'm curious about the nature of the Greek underworld. Is it common for this underworld to be a place of punishment? Is it a place of resting? Is it a place for eternal life? Does it depend on which part of the underworld you're in? What's the story there?
Well, it depends on the texts, again, a little bit, because as well as having all these different texts having sort of different reasons for bringing up the underworld, they all have quite different purposes in terms of their views of life and how things go to some extent. So in the Iliad, the underworld is a place which is just grey and depressing, and the dead exist in it, but we don't hear very much more about them. And similarly, when Odysseus talks to the dead on the borders of the underworld, he finds it very grey and depressing. And many of the ghosts are not particularly happy, including Achilles, who is sort of famously unhappy about being dead. And they just sort of hang around and talk to each other, as far as we can tell. They don't seem to be doing very much else. Achilles is described as having many attendants and looking quite grand, so the assumption is they've got some semblance of kind of physical presence and life, because he must have, things in order to be grand, possessions and so on. But they just hang around and are talked to by Odysseus. They don't do much else. In terms of punishment, in these texts, there are a couple of these individuals like Sisyphus who are punished, but mostly it's not mortals who are being punished in the underworld, it's the Titans for Homer.
Interesting.
As we get later, we start to get more depictions of the underworld being a place where you're kind of judged and you have an option of a good fate, which might be a journey to the plains of Elysium or the Isles of the Blessed, or a neutral fate where you just sort of hang around in death, or for some people, punishment. And the punishment element gets stronger and stronger as you move into particularly Christian theology, and then things like Dante's Inferno take levels of punishment in the underworld to a whole new level.
Let's go here. Let's see. So we have these rooms where you're given a choice between two different boons from two Olympians. And so here we've got a choice between a boon from Artemis and then from Demeter. And I went for the one for Demeter. And so for whichever boon you do not select, that god will kind of bring in enemies and then also strike down with powers from Olympus to try to kill you. And then after a set amount of time, they'll kind of give up and say, oh, here's a boon. So these rooms are kind of worthwhile in the sense that you can get two boons for one, but at the same time, they're particularly dangerous because you've got to deal not just with enemies, but then also the power of the gods trying to kill you at the same time. And I like these runes because I think they touch on kind of one of the areas I think most people associate with the gods of Olympus, and that's jealousy, this kind of jealous god rage that at least I remember from studying Greek mythology in school. And I'm wondering, what do you make of the ways in which the kind of personality of these gods are depicted, in particular in these settings where they kind of show off their anger and their jealousy?
Yeah, I think it's as you say, it's something we associate with the Greek gods and sort of the Greek myths we know, and that's because it's in a lot of the representations of the gods from this period. So even in the Iliad, if we go sort of right back to the beginning, but the same is true in Hesiod's text a little bit later and in tragedy and so on, we have an awful lot of examples of gods getting fed up with each other. So in the Iliad, some of the gods fight with each other because some of them are on the Greek side and some of them are on the Trojan side. Or, for example, Athena is sent to fight Ares off the battlefield via Zeus because Zeus doesn't want him interfering any longer. And there's an indication there that Athena and Ares are not good friends, which seems to kind of draw on a wider mythical tradition. And when we get down to things like tragedy, we get even more extreme examples of this. So there's a play by Euripides called The Hippolytus, in which at the end of the play, we're told Aphrodite has been punishing the individual Hippolytus for not loving her enough. And Artemis, who is Hippolytus's kind of patron goddess, shows up and says, well, don't worry, I see that you are dying, and, fair enough. What I'll do is I'll kill Aphrodite's favorite for you. So we get this really kind of horrifying idea of these gods striking through humans at one another, but the only people who suffer, therefore, are the mortals involved. And so this is it's a very common feature of gods in kind of varying degrees of conflict, and jealousy and rage and so on are often motivations for this kind of disagreement between them.
So here we've got one of my favorite characters, the boatman Charon, and he doesn't say very much.
Charon, mate. Now, hypothetically, if I provided you with, say, 1,000 coins, would you be willing to give me a ride in your beautiful boat upriver?
Just a lot of grunting.
Does that ever change? Is he ever going to become more articulate?
So I don't want to spoil anything, but at least in what I've played, and I've played through most of the game, it has not changed. So that's disappointing. Maybe in a DLC, I don't know, but I'd be fascinated to see him just kind of burst out in song or something like that. I think that'd be a clever touch. So he offers up kind of an assortment of wares that you can use to buy. And I was wondering, I'm familiar with Chiron and, kind of the idea of having coins to present the boatman as you go into the underworld. But I assume that this feature of selling wares to people living in the underworld is an artifact of the game and not necessarily Greek mythology.
Yes, Charon, he's quite popular in artistic representations from the sort of 5th and 4th century BC. They quite like him as the boatman on the River of the Dead. But he doesn't, there are no kind of major stories associated with him because all he does is ferry the dead across. And in fact, in the Odyssey, it's Hermes who kind of takes over this role a little bit by leading the souls just directly down into the underworld. We bypass Charon entirely. So where he does appear, he has a relatively minor role. He does usually take a fare. It is 2 coins in the 5th century Athens, apparently, according to, again, this is a reference in a comedy rather than necessarily being a kind of religious or philosophical text, but supposedly it's 2 coins for Charon. But we never hear what he does with all this money in Greek myth. He just keeps it, I guess.
Well, from the look of it, I don't know if you noticed his necklace, but it's covered in coins. So he's blinged out, at least in this version of the underworld. So here we've got our first boss, and this is Meg. And she is the first of the Furies, and there's 2 other Furies that show up later in the game, and I don't know if we'll be able to see them. But at least in this version of the Underworld, Meg has an on-again, off-again romance with Zagreus, and yet she is being presented here as the kind of boss to get out of Tartarus, and so their relationship is on the rocks at the moment, let's say.
I hope enough. Not that it's any of your business anymore.
Your family is here, and so is your responsibility. You're running from yourself.
Okay, let's see if I can embarrass myself horrifically in trying to fight this boss.
Meg is really difficult, I thought.
Whoops. Oh dear, that was very painful. Yeah, I'm not doing too well right now. Oh, shucks. Well, at least I have a Death Defiance. Let's see if I can finish this off. Oh, no. Well, couldn't beat her.
No. I think that's fair enough. I didn't want to say, while you were fighting, didn't want to distract you. But I mean, the Furies are supposed to be very terrifying enemies, really, in Greek and later mythologies. So it should be hard work to have to get past them.
So here we are back in the House of Hades. This is where the game starts off, and it dumps you out into this pool, and then you go back and you can interact with all of your family members and friends living in the House of Hades. So here's Hypnos.
Fury got you again. She is unstoppable, isn't she? One time, I tried to stop her on the way to have a chat with your dad, and she didn't even turn her head.
And he's kind of presented as a lackey to Hades. He's presented as a bit of a ditz, I would say. And so he kind of dunks on you when you come back in and, describes how you died out in the underworld. And then here's Hades.
Call my chambers a mess. Look at your desk, father. Whatever happened to your court musician, huh? Where's his sentencing parchment work? Stuck in Tartarus, all because he stopped singing for you on command?
My desk is far more organized than you, boy. And if you're so concerned about our court musician, why don't you commute his sentence yourself? Seeing as I haven't gotten around to it yet.
Also, here they're talking about kind of matters within the House of Hades, about music, and then about the mess in Zagreus' room. So I think it's funny to me that we've got in this game kind of this depiction of the gods, Greek mythology, but it's set within the kind of a confines of a bickering, dysfunctional family. And I feel like these types of portrayals of the Greek underworld, the Olympians, Greek mythology in general, are pretty popular to depict them as kind of this dysfunctional family. And I'm wondering, why do we see these kind of depictions? Is it a basis in the text, in the original text of Greek mythology, or is this something that you think is developed because of our kind of modern interest in family dramas?
I think it's a mix of both. So certainly I've already mentioned that the gods are depicted in quite a lot of Greek texts as having kind of conflicts and so on, having quite personal relationships with one another. But they're also, particularly in some of the texts we've already talked about, so slightly less the theogony, but certainly in the Iliad, they're portrayed as relatively casual about things, partly because, of course, they can't die. So the Iliad is a poem in which an awful lot of mortals die or anticipate their future death, which is extremely grim. For the gods, this is all just a game. They just kind of play around. They do have a battle, but they can't hurt each other, so there's not really any real, it's just for fun for them. There's no stakes. And also they sometimes make jokes or play tricks on one another. When Hermes, in the Hymn of Hermes, when Hermes first shows up, he is described as being born and then still as a toddler going and stealing some cattle from his brother Apollo. And this is how they first meet, apparently, because he's a tricksy god. So kind of jokes and little stories of this kind are part of the myths, even from their sort of very earliest texts that we've got. But I also think that then the comparison between this and particularly the Christian tradition has led to a slightly sometimes trivializing interpretive way of thinking about this. So if you think about the Iliad again, some scholars for quite a long time talked about the gods as kind of light relief, because they're a bit more casual, or because they're because the things involved don't really affect them, and because sometimes they make jokes. And this is partly just because there's a sort of element of surprise that the gods aren't more serious. and therefore they're treated as sort of trivial. Whereas I think it seems to me that the Greeks were perfectly capable of holding multiple conceptions of their gods at the same time, so that they could be sometimes funny. Dionysus can go down to the underworld to pick up his favorite playwright, and this can be a scene of a comedy, but also Dionysus can be the horrifying god who causes a king's mother to rip him to pieces. This is in a play of Euripides. And also he can be a god who turns whole cities into crazed cults worshipping Dionysus and abandoning all other things. And he can be the god that you would quite like to pray to before you have a party, because you'd like to have a good party. So they're very happy with sort of thinking about multifaceted ways of thinking about the gods. And to some extent, that has not, these days it really is, but in kind of later traditions, because that's certainly not how the Christian tradition thinks of its divinities, this has led to sort of slightly minimizing trait in receptions of the Greek gods.
So here we've got Orpheus. This is the court musician. And at least early on, Orpheus is not really feeling in the mood to play music.
Orpheus is, of course, the most famous example of someone who comes down to the underworld and goes back, but nonetheless fails in his journey. He comes down for his wife, Eurydice. But as the famous story goes, looks back. He plays a song that's so beautiful that Hades and Persephone say, okay, you can take her back. But looks back at her on the way out, despite being told not to, and therefore she goes back down into the underworld. And then poor old Orpheus it's interesting how many of these myths are kind of tied together, and that is presumably why a lot of them are in this game, because Orpheus ends his life being torn apart by some worshippers of Dionysus.
Oh, okay. Well, Dionysus gives and Dionysus takes away.
Yes.
And so here's Nyx, and Nyx is an important character in the game, primarily because she is the mother of many of the other characters in the underworld, but also because she is the one who's kind of actively encouraging Zagreus to make it to the world of or Greece, to make it to Greece, to escape the underworld. And the reasoning for that, and I'll say this is a spoiler here, but I assume most players probably know, is that Zagreus is not trying to reach Olympus, but is instead trying to find his mother. It turns out not to be Nyx, who the Olympians assume is Zagreus' mother, but instead is Persephone.
I trust that the mirror in your bedchamber has proved satisfactory, dear child.
And Nyx has an incredible look here. Just a lot of ornamentation, excellent earrings, just fantastic outfit.
Better than I could have possibly imagined, Nyx. You mentioned there was something.
I think you are as well. Then it shall be as you wish.
Thank you.
Awesome. Let's see. Let's take a look. We've got these shades here that kind of mill about in the underworld, and they usually have these funny lines here. And sometimes it has the cause of death being something like they were stampeded, and the shade will say, why is everybody concerned about the horse? And then here's Achilles, who is serving as kind of a weapons trainer, master of arms in the House of Hades. And he has, kind of similar to Orpheus and the other characters in the game, a storyline that you can follow through.
The sealed weapons by your chambers. Your father won't observe their absence, I don't think. They remind him of a time he stood together with his brothers and sisters. He wants nothing more to do with any of that.
So we talked quite a bit about Achilles with relation to Total War Troy, and I'm wondering, what do you think of what you've seen of Achilles so far in this game?
I think he's really interesting. He's obviously, in comparison to the Achilles we get in the Trojan War, he is very mellow in this game. He's helpful, he's very nice and encouraging to Zagreus. He keeps calling him lad and suggesting there's sort of affectionate trainer bond in there. But this is itself, interestingly, perhaps related to the tradition, the Greek tradition of what happens to Achilles after his death, because I mentioned that when Odysseus goes to the underworld, Achilles is very unhappy with being dead. And this is quite striking because, quite famously, Achilles' choice in the Iliad is to live a short period of time with a great deal of glory, or go and live happily in Greece with his father for a very long time and have very little glory. And supposedly he has chosen glory by coming to Troy, although in fact the loss of Patroclus kind of sets him on a course that is not totally his choice because of the degree of emotion involved. But when Odysseus goes down and sees him in the underworld, he says, "Oh, you know, things look great for you, Odysseus. You're Achilles. You're a king, even here in the underworld." And Achilles says, "I would rather be a peasant workman on a farm and still be alive than I would be down here. Can you tell me about my family?" So Achilles seems to be regretting his choice, and he shares this wisdom which Odysseus doesn't really understand at this point, because he thinks it's still great to die with glory, and Achilles is saying, actually, I've realized it's not. And in later traditions, Achilles gets to go and live on the Isle of the Blessed with the most fortunate heroes, and sometimes marries Helen as well, the cause of the Trojan War.
No
over
kidding.
There.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
What fun.
So the Greeks seem to have had a very kind of a great interest in Achilles as a kind of figure, both alive, but also what happens to this figure if your whole life is bound up in dying gloriously. Well, what about after you're dead? What is that experience going to be like for you? And so they kind of adjust him and give him this different wife and different living situation and all this wisdom in the Odyssey that he didn't have before. So to some extent, the game, by making him this kind of friendly trainer figure, I think is drawing on that quite nicely.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. And, I would say that in terms of that legacy, then the game is probably in good stead to kind of reinterpret Achilles however they want, given that kind of long history of, what you might call retconning Achilles for whatever purpose you want him to serve.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's true of all Greek myth, really. We've talked about, some of the sources for these things that we've been looking at, and portrayals of the gods and so on. But the Greeks had no problem ever changing a myth to write a different tragedy, or because the poem they're singing in celebration of a particular patron, perhaps they want to celebrate his local hero more than the original myth does, so they kind of amp it up a little bit. Their myth is extremely flexible. And so I think they would have appreciated something like this, and all the ways it kind of works with what does exist, but creates new things and new ideas and new relationships and so on out of that. That's a very Greek approach to how myth should work as well.
So I just wanted to take a moment to show off the weapons here. And these are kind of weapons that are discussed quite a bit in the game. They, in many ways, they have personalities. You start out with Stydius, the blade, but that you can use the spear, which Achilles talks quite a bit about. He seems to claim it as a weapon that he used when he was alive. You've got this shield that, each of these weapons come with different powers, different abilities. The bow, which is discussed quite a bit by Artemis and by Ares, and then also to a certain extent by Athena. So if you show up into an area where you can pick up a boon and have a conversation with a Greek god, they'll discuss, the history of this weapon, and how it had been used against the Titans, or how it had been used by one of these great heroes or in Greece. And then the twist, the fist, I should say, here, which I just died using, so I'm not a huge fan. And then finally, we have this weapon here at the end, a railgun, which, obviously, guns not necessarily a part of Greek mythology, I assume, but they do the same thing with this weapon. They'll discuss the gun if you, bring it in with a conversation with a god, or if you talk to Achilles about it. So kind of a fascinating inclusion, but one I think that fits in well with kind of the video game aspect of Hades. Okay, well, I'm going to maybe the last 15 minutes or so jump out of this playthrough of the game and go back to my original playthrough, which again, if you were sensitive to spoilers, maybe shut off the video now until you've had a chance to play through. But I've got this version, the kind of early version of the game, the new playthrough in the House of Hades. But this one I've got it set up at a save where I'm going to be battling against the final boss of Elysium, the kind of top level of the underworld, against Theseus. And so I was really curious about your perspective on Theseus, and I know, Kate, that you haven't quite gotten to Elysium yet, so I'm hoping you can share with me your kind of feelings on what you think of this depiction of Theseus that we're about to see.
Great.
Rematch.
We've nothing left to say to one another, Hellspawn, other than to battle.
So you've got Theseus here, hero of Athens, and he doesn't have much to say now because I've beaten the game. I've beaten him several times, and I think he's just kind of gone through all of his dialogue. But he is presented as basically being a huge dick, just a huge asshole. And I'm wondering, is that resembled at all in any of Greek mythology? Because from what I know about Theseus, he's kind of held up as this iconic hero, but here in this game, he's presented as, kind of a member of Cobra Kai from Karate Kid. He's just like the worst of the worst in terms of these bosses on the way out of the underworld.
It's sort of both. So it's quite interesting that they called him their hero of Athens, because the Athenians have quite a big role in shifting the reputation of Theseus. Before he becomes the sort of Athenian national hero, there are some really problematic things associated with Theseus, and most famously, one that even the Athenians cannot get rid of, is the fact that he says he'll marry Ariadne if she helps him out of the labyrinth. She does this, they go off on a boat together, and then he just ditches her on an island. So the Athenians say that this is because Athena told him he had to. So fair enough, if a god tells you, you can get away with it. But other traditions include him just forgetting or just deciding that he didn't really want to marry her, he wanted someone kind of cooler. So this is kind of a really problematic tradition, and there are sort of other things as well. The fact that his father dies on the way back from this journey because he doesn't change the sails of his ship. He's supposed to change the sails. Again, this is quite a famous story to, the colour actually varies in different Greek accounts, but quite famously, it is to white sails to show he's safe, and he forgets and he leaves the black sails up, and therefore his father thinks that Theseus is dead and the ship is just coming back to let him know, and so he kills himself. And again, this is something the Athenians couldn't really get rid of. It's a well-established tradition in Theseus, much before they start sort of adopting him as their own. So he has got some extremely problematic elements. And the Athenians try and adjust these and make them a bit better. He's got some appearances in Greek tragedy, which some people, not me actually, this is an interesting facet of my own research. I'm not convinced that Theseus is very whitewashed by Greek tragedy, but others are. But the existence of these sort of conflicting myths, it's a little bit like we were saying with the gods. The Greeks are able to kind of hold multiple ideas about the gods. They can be deeply problematic, but also worthy of worship. Mm-hmm. Similarly, a lot of these heroes, Theseus is one of the worst, but Heracles has some enormously problematic aspects in his past myth. Almost all of them have something that goes wrong, or they do badly, or particularly in relation to their families, a lot of them have sort of serious family trouble. So it's a little bit in the original tradition. Awesome. And I think that side of things, the problematic side of people like Theseus and, in fact, Jason, of Jason and the Argonauts, is something that modern reception has really picked up on and taken quite far. Mm-hmm. It's been something they're particularly interested in.
Well, I'm just so fascinated by the way you talk about these texts, because it seems like they very much fall in line with the ways in which, kind of modern authors have attempted to adapt Greek mythology, in the sense that they're kind of picking and choosing which aspects to focus on and kind of having two ideas about a character at once. And that, it surprises me to hear that, and, hear it in such a way that it makes it seem that the ancient Greeks, were pretty sophisticated in their approach, not only to the gods, but then also their approach to literature and writing, and the way that they could, kind of hold these two ideas at the same time. I think that's fascinating. It makes me want to study more classical history, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, it is really interesting. Particularly, it's really interesting how totally unfazed they are by doing effectively completely opposite interpretations very close together. So, quite an interesting example is some plays by Sophocles, sort of again in my research area, where he presents Odysseus. As really contrasting figures. So in Sophocles' Philoctetes, Odysseus is a betrayer. He is tricksy, he lies all the time, he tries to encourage Achilles, his son Neoptolemus, to lie and betray poor old Philoctetes. He's a terrible character. But in another play, also by Sophocles, that would have been performed in a different year, but nonetheless, if you're going to see a Sophoclean play, it's a play by Sophocles. Odysseus is this kind of very wise, very sympathetic figure to Ajax. He doesn't want to mock his enemies. He even disagrees with the goddess Athena that it's a good thing to mock one's enemies. Instead, he feels sorry for him. He stands up for the dead Ajax against Agamemnon and Menelaus. He sympathizes with Ajax's family. So we've got kind of opposite Odysseus's by the same author.
Yeah.
In festivals a little way apart, but it's like releasing one Captain America film where Captain America's great, and then another Captain America film 5 years later where Captain America is a complete douchebag.
Yeah.
And just saying, have both, enjoy. It's really interesting.
It does remind, I think the comparison to Captain America and to comic books, the world of comic books, is a really good one, because that happens all the time where you have a series of comics related to a character, Captain America, Batman, Superman, whatever, what have you, Wonder Woman. And that goes on for a few years. And then a new author comes along, or maybe even the same author, and they completely reimagine the same character. And I think, it's often the case that comic book fans, I wouldn't really throw myself into this category, but they talk about comic books as kind of modern mythology, right? Mythology for the modern age. And, I think maybe in terms of the ways in which Greek mythology kind of retcons its own characters, maybe there is some similarity there.
Yes, absolutely. I think there really is. And in the fact that you can be in kind of different series as well in comic books, if you've got a crossover character moving into a different series, they may or may not be behaving how they would in their kind of home series. The same is very true in Greek myths as well. If they move into a different kind of text, they become very different. So yeah, I think that's a really nice analogy.
So there's a couple of things I wanted to point out. First, this is the final area of Elysium. So we didn't get to see all the other characters in this territory. But you can get a sense here from the final area of what Elysium looks like. And this is presented in the game as kind of the top level of the underworld, in which the greatest heroes of Greek life live. And they fight and they kill each other and they die. But this is kind of a habit that they want to pursue, to continue to pursue glory even in the underworld. And so you've got these examples here of the reliefs up against the wall, the pottery here, these huge kind of planters with kind of famous battles and heroes pointed out. And the setting is kind of, we didn't get a chance to look at this, but the setting is kind of dreamlike in its appearance, kind of a little bit greenish, but it's supposed to have a more pleasant climate. And then, of course, you get to the end here, and they've got this battle arena featuring the Minotaur, and then also Theseus, who is the great hero for Elysium. But then we've got this solitary fan over here in the corner for Zagreus.
Oh, that's so lovely.
It's so cute. It's my favorite part of this game, is going to talk to this one super fan shade after winning this battle. So it's really a huge treat. But I was going to carry on here to go into the Temple of Styx. So this is the final territory of the game, and we probably don't have time to go through and play the entire part of this, but I did want to use this as a jumping off point for talking about the different levels of Hades, at least presented in the game. We've got the first level, which we've seen a lot about already in this episode, Tartarus. The second part, if you get past Meg, you go to Asphodel, which is presented as this kind of volcanic, rivers of lava zone. And then this final level of Elysium, and then going on to the top, you'll go to the Temple of Styx. And so here we get a little smack talk coming from Hades. And let's see if I need to buy anything. And I can't buy that, but it's not a big deal. So we'll keep that Death Defiance, and then we'll go upstairs. So every time you clear a zone, you're presented with this map. So we're moving out of Elysium into the Temple of Styx, which is presented as just being just underground, just beneath the surface. Picking up some extra cash here. So when you reach the Temple of Styx, you initially come in and you're faced with Cerberus, the three-headed hound of hell. And Cerberus in this game is presented as a fearsome creature, but at the same time as Zagreus's pet dog. And so if Cerberus is in the House of Hades, you can go up and pet him and kind of talk to him as you would a pet. It's pretty lovely, actually. But here, Cerberus is presented as the final obstacle to get out to the real world, to get out to Greece. But instead of fighting, you've got to go into the temple system here to the left and choose one of these doorways, looking for a bag of kind of disgusting treats that Cerberus will eat and use as an excuse to leave this door unoccupied, so that Zagreus can go to the outside world.
So pleased you don't have to fight him. I was really worried you were going to say you have to fight
No.
Cerberus. And he's such a lovely pet in the House of Hades. I don't think I could bear that.
No, and they play upon this idea when you first get up here. So Zagreus will come in and he'll go, "Oh no," and he thinks he has to fight his dog. And so he starts kind of approaching it in this really macho tone, kind of threatening Zagreus, or not threatening Cerberus in kind of a mocking way. But then he's like, "No, really, I'm not going to fight you. You're not going to fight me. So what can we do?" And so Cerberus, kind of hints that there's a bag of treats somewhere hidden in this temple. And so if you can go and find that, then I can use that as an excuse to leave my guard and let you out. So that's how they handle it. But these rooms, as we'll see here in a moment, are pretty difficult. They're kind of like mini zones that you've experienced up to this point in Asphodel and Tartarus and Elysium, and they are filled with some of the most difficult enemies in the game. So let's take a look at one of these. Sorry we didn't get a chance to look at these enemies, but if you want to survive, you have to try to kill them as quickly as possible. But there's a lot of rats here, and I'm just curious. I've never heard of the Temple of Styx. I don't know if that is a part of Greek mythology. I was wondering, is there any reference to the Temple of Styx? I know the river is referred to as Styx. What is going on with Styx in Greek mythology?
Well, not very much. So I'm not aware of a Temple of Styx. Having said that, probably some classicist is going to write to me and say, yes, of course, here it is. Actually, if you know that, then please let me know. That would be really useful. Styx, yes, is a river and also is another one of these creatures like Chaos. So Styx has kind of some limited personification, but not really. Mm-hmm. It is both the river and the god, but it doesn't kind of do anything beyond that. It's not originally always the boundary. It's always a river associated with the underworld, but it's not always the kind of boundary between the real world and, or the living world, I suppose, and the underworld. This seems to be a kind of later version that sometimes Acheron is the river that Charon takes people across rather than Styx. But it is always a river associated with the underworld, and that's pretty much it. There's not an awful lot else. There are some myths about dipping people into Styx, which supposedly, again, this is later, however, is something associated with Achilles. So there is a later myth where Thetis dips Achilles into the River Styx in order to kind of partially immortalize him. And this is because the goddess Styx is very powerful. So it's not sort of the river itself, it's the power of the goddess that has this effect. But you get to the power of the goddess by dipping in the river. It's not, this sort of thing is not always all that logical, really.
I'm getting that sense, yeah.
Yeah. But no, temples to Styx, I'm not aware of any tradition in that regard. Most of these other realms, although Asphodel is a bit of a kind of peculiar one, but most of these other realms at least have some connection to the Greek myths and the accounts of the underworld. This one, as Styx as the river, is the only one I'm really familiar with.
So in some of the literature, at least, there's this, at least some idea that there's different levels to the underworld, right?
Well, regions rather than levels in the Greek version. So, although, I mean, it's a bit complicated. So there is a sense in the Iliad and in Hesiod that there is a level Tartarus, which is below the rest of the underworld. Actually, in fact, for the Greeks, below Hades, which is the general underworld, rather than in this game where Hades is kind of, House of Hades is the bottom. Tartarus is the very depths, and that's why the Titans and Kronos are locked up in there by Zeus when he takes over, because that's so deep they can't get out. So that kind of suggests a sense of depth, extra depth. But the others, the Plains of Elysium and Asphodel is a plant that grows in the fields of Asphodel, which is just a regular part of the underworld. They're kind of different areas or different regions, and sometimes the Elysium Plains are actually quite far away regions. Or there's an area where Nyx lives, which is described as Nyx and some of her children sometimes live at kind of the ends of the earth, which is felt to be different, but possibly also under the earth. So there's kind of width, but not depth.
Gotcha.
We really get this idea of going up and down in the underworld. Again, actually, it's Dante that really brings that out and makes that such a strong element of kind of underworld reception, because Dante's Inferno, of course, goes down kind of like a funnel, level by level. And then that gets picked up and reproduced in a lot of these modern versions.
And of course, Dante's Inferno was created as a game by electronic artists back in
yes,
of the early 2000s, mid 2000s, I think. So a lot of popularity for mythology and the underworld in games. And I think it's interesting that, obviously this game seems to take a little bit of liberty with the kind of depiction of these zones as levels, but at least they are depicted as different zones or different territories, which seems to have at least some basis in some of the original accounts of the underworld. So I think that's fascinating. Okay, great. So this is, I chose the right door, in other words. And so we've got this disgusting bag of treats, satyr sack, as it's referred to as. And this is what Cerberus is after. And I don't know what's in there. You never get to see inside the satyr sack, but I assume it's a collection of leftover bits from these rats and snakes that you fight in this zone. So disgusting, nonetheless.
What's in this stuff?
So I am going to go over here. And Kate, how are we doing on time? Are you okay to talk for a little while longer? Okay.
Yep, that's fine.
That gives me an opportunity to fight the final boss. So let's see, what kind of boon should I pick up? I'm going to pick up this one from Demeter. Specialist Stronger. No. Cast Chill. These aren't great.
I'm really bad at using cast. That's probably why I haven't got very far. I just sort of forget it exists quite a lot of the time and just don't really use it.
And this seems to be the storehouse for Charon. It's got all of these goods and money and all these extra boons that you can pick up at the end if you've got enough money. All All right, I don't think there's anything else I wanted to touch on. This is the codex again, and as you can see, I've kind of filled it out in more detail based on playing it quite a bit. I won't tell the viewers how much I played it, but Kate has seen the number of hours I've poured into this game, and it's pretty embarrassing. It could be good basis for blackmail in case I go up for an extended contract at my job. And then Persephone, who is in the game as the ultimate goal of the game, and at this point, she has been brought back to the underworld on her own accord. So once you get out of the underworld, you defeat the final boss. You bring your mother home after several attempts. I think you have to make 10 successful clearances of the underworld in order to finally bring Persephone back. And then these are the different zones. And then so we've got the River Styx, and this is the Temple of Styx. And let me see, we can take a look at down here just very quickly. These are some of the enemies from Elysium. So we've got these kind of chariot enemies, but then the heroes of Elysium, including these sword characters, long spear, and then strongbow characters, and then one with a shield. And then we get into the Temple of Styx. We've got these vermin, we've got these snake stones, and then the satyr cultists, who are particularly nasty figures here in the underworld.
I think is quite interesting is that they've really picked on what is a kind of minor, or at least is often treated as sort of minor variant of myths about the underworld and Zagreus and sort of Dionysus and so on, the Orphic myths, which focus on Orpheus as a kind of leading hero and have a kind of whole separate way of thinking about the afterlife and so on. But the association between Zagreus and Dionysus probably comes up in the Orphic tradition. And things like satyrs, because they're associated with Dionysus, are slightly closer to the kind of Orphic tradition. This is, it probably is fairly mainstream in ancient Greece, but it is nonetheless treated as a kind of a weird, a mystery religion, a slightly separate way of thinking about theology. But quite a lot of it seems to have crept into this game, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, goat-faced fiends. And these are, I don't know, they're hard to describe. They're presented as kind of humanoid figures, but also goats. I don't know. It's a really strange thing, but they hang out with vermin in the Temple of Styx. So tough luck for them, I suppose. Oh yeah, and then these are the other Furies. I don't know if you've run apart Alecto and Tisiphone, but these are alternate Furies that you can face if you defeat Meg a number of times. So yeah, just wanted to throw that in there. All right, let's give Cerberus his treat.
Joyfully, the Hound of Hell accepts another satyr sack.
See you, boy.
Cerberus vanquished, obviously, but not in actuality.
Get you for last time, father.
Okay, so we'll.
This is so exciting. Now I don't need to play the rest of the game.
Oh, don't say that. It is really, it's exciting to get here for the first time.
Blast, but you're persistent even now. But let us see how strong you are as well.
I love the voice actor for Hades. It seems spot on.
It's so, particularly when you irritate him and he says something really angry, you actually almost sort of flinch.
Yeah.
Just anger so well.
Yeah, and so we are in Greece now, and the Greek world at this time is covered in snow, and this is spoilers, obviously, but if you've gotten to this point, I might as well tell you. It's presented that Demeter is kind of casting her powers around the world, covering it in snow, because she's searching for her daughter, Persephone. And so I think there's a little bit of post-game material that I haven't gone through in which you kind of maybe answer these questions related to Demeter and Persephone, but I haven't gotten to that point yet. I think it's kind of something you do as bonus material after you bring Persephone home. So a really tough figure here, and we'll see if I can defeat him within the next few minutes. I don't want to hold this episode up too long. Whoops. And it's certainly in this battle where you make the most use of your Death Defiance power-up, which you can see over my health bar. And that is those little notches there with the faces. They give you extra opportunities to continue to play after you've been killed, which happens quite a bit here against Hades.
thing I have to say I don't really understand is why Hades is so keen to keep Zagreus in anyway. I mean, they don't seem to get on all that well.
Well, so here's the thing, is that, and this is, again, spoilers, is that the rationale Hades has for keeping him in is that he's worried that if Zagreus discovers his mother, that means that the Olympians will find out about her as well, and it'll cause a war between the underworld and Olympus that might threaten the life of Persephone. So that's the rationale.
Ah, interesting. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Oh, okay, so that's my first Death Defiance. Let's see if I can wrap this up. Uh-oh. Okay, gotta run away. Gotta run. So it's an incredible, depressing moment when you first defeat Hades, and he reemerges with this second form that's even more difficult than the first. I suppose it's not a big surprise in terms of video games that he would have a second form, but you know, after having gotten through all the levels of hell, having finally gotten to Hades, to again be presented with a new version of him is really a pain in the butt. Ooh, shoot.
Those grabbing hands are very Disney's Hercules.
It is. Yeah. And I'm surprised that Hercules, at least in what I've played so far, hasn't shown up in this game.
Yes, because he is one of the famous examples of heroes who do go down to the underworld, like Orpheus or Theseus, who both appear. So
it's interesting. It could be maybe a post-release expansion pack or DLC, perhaps. I don't know.
Perhaps he's on Olympus. There are two versions of what happens to Hercules after he dies. In the Homeric texts, he has one body in the underworld as a dead person and one up on Olympus. In later versions, he just is made a god and goes to live on Olympus.
So here we are. I've beaten the game.
Hey.
Yeah, hooray. I feel I can hold my head up high after being defeated by Meg in the other playthrough. So here you've got a list of the different boons that you used, and I think the ones that you used the most are the ones with the little notch to the top left of the boon. And then it shows how many times I've beaten the game, how quickly I've done it. And so I've done this 13 times, and I had a streak of 7 wins that was defeated recently. Cried a little tear about that. So here you've got Titan Blood, which you use as an upgrade, and then some gemstones, which you can use to upgrade the House of Hades. And then once you leave here, before you bring Persephone back, you go and visit Persephone on a farm where she's kind of living her life unaffected by the snow all around. And now that I've brought her back to the underworld, it just kind of gives you this quick ending without actually visiting the farm.
Cottage of Persephone sufficient times. The stubborn underworld prince nevertheless attempts to go there once again, although his memory of it shall have to do.
Oh no.
Taken by the Styx, and it's funny when you return to the House of Hades and you talk to Hypnos. Let's see if he does it this time.
I think.
Welcome to the House of Hades, and thanks for dying.
So usually when you come back after defeating Hades and you've died in Greece, it says to Hypnos that you've died of natural causes, and he's questioning you about what natural causes actually are. So it's kind of funny. So here we've got kind of the late stage underworld. Let's give Cerberus some attention here. I think it's very strange in this game you can only pet one of the heads. I don't know why that is, but
There was an article about that on Kotaku.
Oh, was there?
From the writers, yes. Although I can't remember what they said, but there is a reason for it.
I'll have to look that up. But then here you've got most of the other characters available. Nyx, Orpheus. I've upgraded the lounge area quite a bit more. And then here we've got another character. We've got Persephone talking to Thanatos. So let's see what they say here.
Persephone, all of us, we are most pleased you're back. If there is anything that I can do to ease your acclimation to this house, you need but ask.
So Thanatos is presented as your half-brother and as a kind of a significant rival to Zagreus in terms of skill and mastery of the underworld. And I want to say he is a potential romantic option if you go down that course. I haven't done that just yet. I've been focusing on trying to beat the game as many times as possible.
Why, thank you, Thanatos. I'll take you up on that if I can think of anything anytime soon. But my, you've grown. I understand you've been looking after my son in the meantime.
So Persephone here is in her underworld garb, but when you see her on the top level in Greece, she's kind of presented as just a common farmer by the game.
Your son, he is very capable of looking after himself, it turns out. Although I try to be there just in case. Though I must beg your pardon, Queen. Someone awaits me on the surface now.
I know how mortals hate waiting around.
And then Achilles, of course. And then there's this funny area that gets opened up, I think maybe after the first time you beat the game. And this is the filing room for the House of Hades. And so you've got all these shades here who are chronicling the dead and determining on where they go in the underworld. And this is kind of presented by the game as an office setting, so you can come over here and inspire these shades as they work, toiling away on the kind of bureaucracy of the underworld.
Hanging in there still.
I love the little faces they do. The shades.
And then
That's so funny.
there's a water cooler here with water from the River Styx.
No.
And I think that does it. Let's see. One thing I did want to take a look at just very, very quickly. Let's talk to Hades here and see what happens.
The Olympians. Will you just tell me what's going on for once? How did my...
I thought she already told you. Come with me now.
Oh, I haven't seen this part. Oh, okay. Well, this is a treat.
Swear to me that you shall never repeat what you are.
So this is Persephone's garden in the underworld.
All right, I swear. I swear in your own name I'll keep what you're about to say between us. So?
So, you had it mostly right before.
I'm sorry, I had no idea that this major spoiler would be included in this video. I apologize. This is new to me as well.
Was unhappy on Olympus, and he knew I was drawn to her. So what did he do? He brought her here, gave her to me as a gift.
So this is a description of how Persephone ended up in the underworld to begin with, and now we're learning that it is from Zeus, Hades' brother. And so I don't know if this bears any resemblance to the actual mythology, but this certainly is something you could assume having played the game narrative up to this point.
It's not the most common version.
But she didn't want to return to Olympus, and you liked her, so you didn't send her away. And you were angry with Zeus for putting you in that position. Cut ties with him.
Yes, the black will go full to fashion. He does whatever he wants. He could have achieved a similar outcome in a limitless number of reasonable ways, rather the result of what was tantamount to kidnapping, even if she wanted to leave.
So in my memory of Greek mythology, it's Hades who kidnaps Persephone. But in this version, it's presented as being Zeus's fault.
Yes, most usually Hades has abducted Persephone against her will and insists on keeping her.
Would be in a bad spot, wouldn't he?
But there are some accounts where they say that Zeus kind of gave her as a wife on the basis that he is her father, so he can. But by far the more usual one is the Hades abduction version.
You know nothing of tempers of mine as your frame of reference, Zagreus. Now
Stay.
enough of this. You know the rest. Remember your oath.
I will. Take care, Father.
Fascinating. Okay. And then there's a good look of Hades here in all of his underworld splendor. And what I was hoping to see is that there's moments where you can leave the room and then come back, and Hades will be holding court, and you'll have a line of shades approaching his bench, basically, as judge, and he will hear their cases. And you don't get to hear what the shades actually tell him, but you get his responses. So it's kind of like a version of Underworld's People's Court. It's pretty funny, but I suppose that's not going to happen now. We've already gone way over time. So, Kate, thank you so much for joining me on this very long episode of History Respawned.
Thanks very much for having me. It was great fun.
And if you enjoy our work here at History Respawn, please check us out at www.historyrespawn.com. And if you want to support our show, please visit our Patreon at www.patreon.com/History Respawn. Until next time, goodbye.